Good morning.
Okay.
So good morning, everybody. This is a presentation of the Center for Future Consciousness. And I'm Tom Lombardo, the director of the Center for Future Consciousness. And the center produces a monthly or sometimes bi-monthly newsletter called Future Consciousness Insights. All of the videos from previous webinars are up on our video school for the Center for Future Consciousness. And being a psychologist, philosopher, futurist, I've been interested in various topics along all of those dimensions of reality. And here's images of most of my books that I've published from the evolution of future consciousness and wisdom consciousness in the future to my science fiction book series. The most recent thing I've published is with Victor Madi of the World Future Study Federation, a dialogue on science fiction, how to achieve planetary wisdom through future consciousness. And that's up for free to read on Victor's website, Alternative Planetary Futures Institute. The mission of the Center for Future Consciousness is to advance the purposeful evolution of humanity through the heightening of future consciousness and wisdom and the inspirational, mythic, and cosmic power of science fiction. This webinar series, The Evolution of Science Fiction, is based on my ongoing published series of books on the history of science fiction. 3 have been published so far. Images of all 3 are up there on the screen, volumes 1, 2, and 3. Right now in the webinar series, we are actually beginning to go into what will be volume 5, the New Wave, Star Wars, and Cyberpunk. And the last couple sessions we had, we talked about the Golden Age through the Silver Age, which would be volume 4, which is in the process of being written right now. But the first 3 are already published. So this is module 14, the new culture and the new wave, 1964 to roughly 1980. The erotic, taboo, blasphemous, dangerous, lyrical, metaphorical, psychedelic, maniacal, and catastrophic. The images up there are actually images from the original covers of Harlan Ellison's 3-volume anthology, Dangerous Visions. And in Dangerous Visions, one of the stories, which we'll talk about today, and indeed Ellison believed, and I believe as well, the best story in that 3-volume series was by Philip Jose Farmer, Writers of the Purple Age. And that novella begins with the quote, "If Jules Verne could have really looked into the future, say 1966 AD, he would have crapped in his pants. And 2166, oh my." And that was from Grandpa Winnigan's unpublished manuscripts, How I Screwed Uncle Sam and Other Private Ejaculations. And that sort of captures that opening quote from Writers of the Purple Age, a lot of the feeling and substance of what would happen in science fiction in the middle to late 1960s and into the 1970s, the new wave of science fiction. And Philip Jose Farmer was one of the key writers and contributors to this new kind of science fiction, which emerged in that roughly 15-year period. I thought I'd just begin with a quick little story regarding the significance of the new wave in my own study and reading and interest in science fiction. When I finished my PhD in psychology in 1973, and I started to teach psychology after having immersed myself in psychology and philosophy for too many years there, I got into this obsession of beginning to read lots and lots of science fiction. And I actually got to the point where I would start creating lists of my favorite authors, my favorite stories, my favorite novels. And I kept a record of them based on how I would rate stories and rate novels. Along the way in doing that, I ended up putting together a list based on my ratings of my favorite authors. And this was based on a lot of reading I did in science fiction in the middle 1970s. And when I went back and I looked at it, it hit me that 4 of my favorite 5 authors, in terms of the ratings of novels and stories, were all writers of the new wave. And as we go through this, I'll point out who those 4 out of my 5 favorite science fiction authors were during that time. But the new wave in the 1970s, although it starts really in the 1960s, had a big impact on my thinking and my interest in science fiction. And as I was putting this 2-part presentation together, because we'll do a second half of the new wave later on this month, what impresses me about it is how much substance and imagination and inventiveness emerged in new wave science fiction in that roughly 15-year period. Now, the last module we did was on the Silver Age. And just as a start, getting into the new wave, I think it's important to do a little quick review of the Silver Age, and in fact, how the Silver Age in many different ways actually contributed to the emergence of the new wave. And the Silver Age, to recall, was science fiction from 1950 to around 1965, up through Philip K. Dick. As you move through the Silver Age into the new wave, there's an amplification of popular cultural critiques, criticisms of Western modernism, going from the Beats to the hippies. So part of the zeitgeist of the time was this emerging, strengthening, critical attitude toward the West and modernity, as modernity had emerged in the West, problems with it. And that's carried over from the Silver Age, where it starts, into the new wave. Consumerism and prosperity were 2 dimensions of modern times which were criticized, beginning in the 50s with Pohl and Kornblut's The Space Merchants, but continuing in through the 1960s and 70s, that this particular dimension of a modern civilization was very suspect and had all kinds of negative repercussions to it. There was an increasing critique of militarization and atomic weapons from the Cold War up through Vietnam. And this shows up both in the Silver Age and again shows up in the new wave, criticizing how the West in particular and has become weaponized, has become extremely militarized and amplified in terms of destructiveness through atomic weapons. There was an increasing critique of industrialism and threats to humanity and the environment, which begins in the at least the 1950s, but definitely takes off when we come up to the new wave. There were images of the self-caused disaster and collapse of Western civilization, beginning with Wyndham and Harrison and Make Room, and the death of grass. So even back in the 1950s and continuing into the 1960s, lots of images are being produced on how we're going to destroy Western civilization due to our militarization, due to our consumerism, due to industrialism, and due to the destruction of the environment. But back in the 1950s, we see a new kind of science fiction writing emerging, for example, in Alfred Bester and Cornwainer Smith, who I talked about before, who develop a much more fantastical and literary style than the Golden Age writers like Heinlein and Asimov of the a decade before. And this enhanced and more artistic literary style is going to move into the new wave in the coming decade. In the 1960s, we see Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land and Time Enough for Love, where there's a significant amount of sex coming up in science fiction and images of messiahs, and the two actually being connected together. And sex would become an increasingly significant theme in the new wave coming up in the 1960s. We see literary soft science fiction, psychological science fiction, like with Sturgeon and Bradbury, I talked about when we talked about the Silver Age. And this is going to move over into the new wave as well. We see psychological science fiction, again, Sturgeon's and Keyes with Flowers for Algernon. And we see in the 1950s and during the Silver Age, religion and spirituality getting mixed up with science fiction, such as in Blish's A Case for Conscience and Arthur C. Clarke and Walter Miller and A Canticle for Leibowitz. Religion and spirituality would be other themes that we see in the 1960s and 1970s in the new wave. Toward the middle of the 1960s, Dune is published, which is ecological, involves different states of consciousness connected up with drugs and Messiah themes again. And all of those themes definitely predominate and become much more significant when we move into the new wave in the decade ahead. And finally, I mentioned in the last presentation, Philip Dick talked about him quite a bit. And Philip Dick playing around with alternate realities and dystopias and drugs and madness and states of consciousness. And he is clearly a bridge between the Silver Age and the New Wave. In fact, if we take his novels, The Three Stigmata of Palma Eldritch, and Ubik, those can be considered New Wave novels because they deal with altered states of consciousness and a very loose and crazy kind of writing style and madness and drugs all mixed together. So that's just a bit of a review of the last presentation, as well as attempting to highlight the fact that the new wave as a different kind of science fiction actually grew out of a lot of themes and ideas that were emerging in science fiction in the 1950s. So what I'm going to be talking about, and I already did, preludes and transitions to the new wave, how the new wave had its foundations in the Silver Age, and then the new culture that's emerging in the 1960s, the pop culture, and how that's connected with the new wave. And then I'm going to talk to begin with about the British New Wave science fiction, the magazine New Worlds, Michael Moorcock, G Ballard, Judith Merrill, and Brian Alvis. And then on the other side of the ocean, we'll talk about the American New Wave with Spinrad, Ellison, Zelazny, Farmer, Delaney, Silverberg, and Dish. And then finally, in part one, which will be today, we'll talk about Kurt Vonnegut and the chronosynclastic infundibulum, and Kurt Vonnegut as a significant new wave writer and of a number of his important novels. And then finally, we'll talk about John Brunner's Stands on Zanzibar and his quartet of dreadful warnings. And I put Vonnegut and Brunner at the end here for today, because I think that Vonnegut and Brunner wrote the two best novels of new wave science fiction. And we'll save them to the end and talk about each of those two novels as we come to the end. There's going to be two parts to this because the new wave science fiction encompasses so much. And so we're going to do a part two in 3 weeks on January 29th. We changed the date. Well, I'll talk about Poe, Frederick Poe, Larry Niven, and Haldeman, and hard science fiction in the war, and science fiction on wars. And from Russia, the Strugatsky brothers, who emerged as significant writers in Russia and then eventually became popular over in the West, and a number of other writers like Gerald, who wrote The Trouble with Tribbles for Star Trek, and others. Talk about anthologies of the time, talk about Kubrick and cinema, science fiction cinema during the New Wave, and then finally talk about the most significant aspect of the New Wave, which is the emergence of a whole slew of women science fiction writers who came to be considered some of the best writers, some of the most intelligent and innovative writers of the New Wave, Ursula Gwen and Johanna Russ and James Tiptree Jr., and how science fiction ends up reflecting culture. Then at the end, we'll do a bit of a summary. So that's two 2-hour sessions altogether. Now, a place to begin with the New Wave. Interestingly, just this last couple months, a new book came out called Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, Radical Science Fiction from 1950 to 1985. And it contains a series of essays written by different students of science fiction on what the new wave of science fiction was, what its significance was. And I would say it's kind of a mixed bag of essays. I've read a lot of them, and some of them are more interesting than others, but it's a good place to start with some of the main themes that are introduced in this book on the new wave. Notice the title is Dangerous Visions and New Worlds. New Worlds refers to the British science fiction magazine, which became the vehicle for the emergence of new wave science fiction in Britain. And Dangerous Visions became the most famous anthology coming out of the United States of new wave science fiction, edited by Harlan Ellison. So those two publications are two seminal works that define what new wave science fiction was, first in Great Britain and then over here in the United States. And some of the themes and ideas that are brought up in that book include the term new wave actually came from French film criticism, but began to get used by science fiction writers like Miller and Priest in the early 1960s to refer to a particular kind of innovative science fiction, both in content and in style, that was often called by members who were writers and fans of it, speculative fiction. And Merrill used it in the middle 1960s to refer to this new wave of speculative fiction that was emerging in England. And it began with Michael Moorcock and his magazine, New Worlds, where he was attempting to publish works that broke the boundary between science fiction and high literature. He wanted to break that down, and he wanted to incorporate into science fiction standards of modern literature. And so new wave writers became much more innovative and articulate and let's see, proficient in writing as a skill of and beyond just imagining science fiction scenarios. But the new wave was also fueled by the counterculture of the 1960s, which I've already beginning to mention before, where the counterculture rejected the values of the contemporary modern world, and new wave science fiction reflected that, rejecting the values of the modern Western world. Excuse me. Science fiction was the ideal medium for rejecting the status quo, and new wave science fiction reflected this liberation from the past, this resistance to the status quo. And new wave science fiction both had a literary agenda to become more literary and a political agenda, which was to critique modern reality, modern Western reality in particular. And new wave science fiction rejected the main themes and heroes of golden age science fiction. In fact, G Ballard suggested we move or shift from outer space to inner space. And there was a renewed focus on dystopias, on the end of the world, and also on a fear of the continuation of our present world. Science fiction is often criticized for how much dystopia we find in it, but part of the dystopia of the new wave, or dystopian writing in the new wave, was to provide a literary critique of what was wrong with the modern world and how we needed to change. It was an impetus for revolution. And in fact, the new wave generated a counter old guard reaction, where many new wave science fiction writers objected to the Vietnam War, but in fact, many science fiction writers of earlier times actually supported the Vietnam War. And the new wave writing also was critiqued by the press, critiqued politically, critiqued by fans. So it generated a lot of controversy. It actually ended up generating controversy in the House of Parliament in England, and we'll come to that story. Now, I've introduced Michael Moorcock already, just as the beginning, and he's the first new wave writer I want to talk about. And what I have down for him in terms of his distinctive qualities are the obscene, blasphemous, and the literary avant-garde. In England, there was a magazine, a science fiction magazine, New Worlds, Fiction of the Future, which began publication back in 1946 and up through 1964, and basically published standard type of science fiction, popular science fiction of the kind associated with the Golden Age and the Silver Age, standard science fiction. In 1964, this young guy of 25, and here's a picture of him when he's rather young, Michael Moorcock becomes the editor of New Worlds. And Michael Moorcock wants to break down the boundary between science fiction and mainstream literature. And Michael Moorcock embraces the literary avant-garde and wants to bring that kind of mentality and style into science fiction. And so the covers of New Worlds all of a sudden shift significantly in what you see on them. And note here, we have a variety of very bizarre covers, including models, naked women, cars, Barbarella, zebras, Escher, some guy in a horse charging a big airplane. What is all of this about? But this is like a new kind of vision of what science fiction is about, that Moorcock, more than anybody else, attempts to champion in science fiction. Now, Moorcock identified himself as an anarchist. And as a writer, he was writing at a very young age and was writing both fantasy and science fiction from a very early age. And he actually made his name first as a writer of great fantasy. Now, notice the first picture I had up on the last slide, when Moorcock is about 25. Now, here's Moorcock about 10 years later. And notice that he's this embodiment of the hippie image. The beard has gotten bigger. He's got on various kinds of accoutrements on his clothing, and he's holding a guitar. Because Moorcock was an accomplished musician, as well as a writer of fantasy and science fiction and an editor, and actually did works together with Blue Oyster Cult. He had his own band. He played multiple different musical instruments. And so he's a kind of Renaissance hippie in Great Britain. And the image of the big fantasy character behind there is Elric. And Elric was his first big success as a writer, but Elric was a series of fantasy novels, not science fiction. Now, Elric is the beginning of what a lot of science fiction historians call the eternal champion in Moorcock's writings. And the eternal champion was an archetypal figure that emerges over and over again in his fiction, and whether it's fantasy or science fiction, that is a balancer of things. Moorcock envisions reality as an ongoing oscillation and conflict between order and chaos, or law and chaos. And Elric is the balancer of bringing balance to when things get out of hand, going one direction or the other. And this eternal champion first shows up in Moorcock's fantasy writings, but then it shows up in his first significant science fiction, the Jerry Cornelius Quartet. And the Jerry Cornelius Quartet, which came out in the middle 1960s and into the 1970s, is where Moorcock begins to show his new wave mentality. Jerry Cornelius wanders through different alternate realities, has an immense amount of sex, at one point resurrects from the dead, participates in a synthesis with another individual who is a female into this superhuman that then destroys all of Europe, has qualities at the beginning of being like James Bond or something out of a 1960s movie, and eventually transforms in appearance from a white guy to a black guy to a Christ figure, and along the way engages in drugs and violence and sex to the nth degree. And this is considered at the beginning Moorcock's most significant science fiction writing. And Jerry Cornelius' note has the initials of JC, which are also Jesus Christ. And Moorcock repeatedly engaged in fiction, whether fantasy or science fiction, which played on the Christ figure, the Messiah figure. Adam Roberts says that Jerry Cornelius, Adam Roberts, the science fiction writer, that Jerry Cornelius was a pataphysical Christ figure. And one can go look up the word pataphysical, which I had to do because I didn't even know what the hell it meant. And as something that goes beyond the metaphysical. And so these novels become increasingly dreamlike and disconnected, and with literary inventiveness going way beyond a simple straight narrative, enter into a kind of irrational drug consciousness in ways. And so as a science fiction writer, he begins to really experiment with how to write science fiction novels and break out of the standards that had been there from before with what constitutes a story, embrace a traditional story, embracing the literary avant-garde. But the story that I read by him during the 1970s, and here he is getting older now, by the way, that impressed me the most was his novella novel, Behold the Man. And to me, it really strikes at the heart of what new wave science fiction was all about, at least part of the significance of it. In Behold the Man, we have a character from the 20th century who was a Jew, by the way, but is obsessed with Christ and whether or not Christ actually rose from the dead. And he meets a physicist who has invented a time machine. And the physicist decides to use him as a guinea pig to test out this time machine. But the character decides where he's going to go or when he's going to go in the time machine. And what he decides he wants to do is he wants to travel back to the Middle East at the time of Christ or Jesus and see whether indeed Christ did rise from the dead. Well, when the time ship goes back in time, it malfunctions, starts to burn and fuse in the sky. John the Baptist sees this light traveling through the heavens, and the ship crashes, the guy's unconscious, and John the Baptist thinks he's the propheted Messiah, and takes care of him. The guy from the 20th century eventually recuperates and goes in search of Jesus and finally finds Mary and Joseph and Jesus, but Mary turns out to be a prostitute. And Joseph is this kind of drunken, weak old man. And he goes into the house where they live. And what he finds in this dark back room is this imbecile who was Jesus of Nazareth, dribbling and repeating over Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Now that is enough to offend most Christians right there, right off the bat. The guy can't believe what he sees, and having memorized the Bible, in particular the New Testament, decides that he's going to play act out all of the things that Jesus supposedly did and said, waiting for the real Jesus to show up. And he goes through all of the motions, plays everything out, and finds himself nailed on the cross. At which point he realizes that the real Jesus is not coming, and indeed, he is the figure from history, and he dies. And that's the end. But the metaphysical paradox, on top of the blasphemy of the story, is that after he dies, 2,000 years later, he is born again. He resurrects as the man of the 20th century. He studies everything that he said from 2 millennia before, memorizes it, and goes back and says it, and then, of course, dies. So the existence of him becomes a circle in time. Who wrote all of those words? Who said all of those words that are in the New Testament ascribed to Jesus Christ? Well, that guy did. But where did he get them from? From reading a book that recorded his very words that he said. So his existence ends up going in a loop. He doesn't have a beginning. He doesn't have an end, which of course is part of the idea of God, that there is no beginning, no end. He's eternal in time, but it's an extremely affrontive story of the idea of a Messiah who attempts to save the world and dies on the cross, but is resurrected in the process. And by the way, the guy was a neurotic, obsessed with his own sins. Now, that one I point out because I think that captures how Moorcock and New Wave science fiction writers really tried to push outside of the boundaries of what is considered acceptable ideas, ideas that go beyond what is the a mindset of at least our Western world, and assault our icons, assault our foundational images. Now, a year or two after Behold the Man, actually just about a year, this book came out from out of England, England Swing Science Fiction, edited by Judith Merrill. And Judith Merrill was a science fiction writer who put together what she thought was a representative sampling of new wave science fiction, including stuff that Moorcock had published in New Worlds, and put this book together, collecting together different notable stories of the new wave and science fiction writing. There's a picture of Judith Merrill, and Judith Merrill was an accomplished science fiction writer back from the late 40s and into the 50s, and edited a whole series of years' best science fiction. But she became exceedingly well known for publishing this anthology in 1967, 1968. And she was living in London at the time. In fact, she was living near Moorcock. And in reviewing this book, one newspaper said it was so far out, it left the understandable galaxy. And there were lots of interesting stories in the book. One of them was The Heat Death of the Universe, about a housewife who is combating entropy while she's trying to take care of her sloppy, messy little kids, and at the end goes insane. And a lot of people might say, you know, I'm not even sure how this is a science fiction novel, and not science fiction story, but it's a very memorable story embedded with a lot of scientific theory, coupled together with a crazy housewife who can't conquer the dust of her house. But the final story in this book was the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, considered as a downhill motor race, and the plan for the assassination of Jacqueline Kennedy by G Ballard. And those two stories have been written a couple of years earlier and were collected into this anthology, and eventually became part of G Ballard's The Atrocity exhibition. And G Ballard, more than anybody else, became the symbol of new wave writing in British science fiction. He was born in Shanghai, was captured by the Japanese, put in a prison camp in 1944. Decades and decades later, he wrote a semi-autobiographical novel called The Empire of the Sun, which was made into a very good movie, but was very psychologically jolted by his experiences as a kid, and became the most inventive of the new wave science fiction writers in Great Britain. He was fascinated with surrealism and pop art. He saw Western progress as a big sham. He saw our traditional vision of our reality as a joke. And he wrote all of these stories and novels, including the one about John F. Kennedy, which you have to read to get a feel for, about the collapse of humanity and Western civilization. In fact, he borrowed from Empedocles in the Four Elements, and Ballard was an extremely literate individual of earth, water, air, and fire, and wrote 4 disaster novels: The Crystal World, The Wind from Nowhere, The Drought or the Burning World, and The Drowned World, in which in each of those, one of the primordial elements destroys humanity. His first story published, Prima Belladonna, occurs on this strange beach, undescribed where it is, where a man grows singing flowers, falls in love with a golden woman with insect eyes, and the woman seems to have sex with an orchid. And it was eventually put in Vermilion Sands. The best of the 4 was The Crystal World, which reads like a psychedelic vision of a reality. His knowledge of crystals and how crystals form, he envisions nature crystallizing and being taken over and spreading from a jungle in Africa. It's an amazing piece of work, amazing imagination, amazing articulation and understanding of crystallization. The first thing I ever read by him, The Subliminal Man, from where the line, "The Signs, Doctor, have you seen the signs?" The Subliminal Man is a story about our future where there's compulsory consumption, and it's against the law to keep appliances for more than a year. After a year, you have to turn in your appliances and get new ones because the world needs consumption, needs production. He wrote a story early on, which I read, called Build Up, about a man who builds an airplane and wants to fly it, but can't find anywhere to fly an airplane because he lives in a city that seems to go on forever. Up, down, right, left, forwards, backwards. It's urbanization, endless urbanization. And one day he gets on a subway that increases in speed and increases in speed. And he goes on and on and on the subway, heading west. And one day he looks up at the sign inside of the subway, and the subway is saying he's heading east now. And he ends up going around in a gigantic billion-mile circle where there's no way out. A very effective, powerful story. A lot of his stuff got put into movie form. The Empire of the Sun was one of them. High Rise was another one where people in a modern building go crazy and go into a violent state. Crash was another one that got turned into a movie. And I just skirted over and didn't say too much about the Atrocity exhibition. And just to go back to it as a final note on him, is that the Atrocity exhibition is a series of chapters, and the chapters do not have what you would call a narrative form. And that includes the chapter on John Fitzgerald Kennedy as a downhill motor race. They are slews of associations between different images, attempting to create like dreamlike visualizations of different ideas and themes. They really break with strict narrative writing in science fiction, which has been what science fiction generally has been about. Now, in that regard, it's important to note then that Ballard, as an artist, as a critic of the West, as a critic of where the West was heading, he was also very innovative in the technique of writing itself. That is, he didn't just simply try to create new visions about the future or about reality. He tried to create a different kind of way of writing about it that doesn't have the same narrative form. I would highly recommend, just to blow your mind, that you try to read the Atrocity Exhibition, just to see what an inventive writer can do. And read John F. Kennedy, considered as the assassination of John F. Kennedy, considered as a downhill motor race, because in a very strange way, it makes sense. So Ballard became the big name, the significant figure in British science fiction. Moorcock and others definitely were very enthusiastic supporters of him, as well as Judith Merrill. Just briefly, Brian Alvis, who was another significant figure in New Wave science fiction, and Brian Alvis here, I have up one of his paintings and one of his books of poetry, was also a painter, was also a poet, published a lot of poetry, in fact. Brian Alvis produced a ton of science fiction over a vast period of time, beginning with Nonstop, which was his first significant science fiction novel. But then he wrote Hot House, which he got a Hugo Award for, because it imagines a future world that's become dominated by plants, that's heated up, and humans have shrunk down in size, and fungus have become intelligent parasites. And it's an amazingly inventive story. You won't call it exactly New Wave, but it definitely was very inventive. And then out came a whole series of stories and novels, very prolific writer in the 1960s. Galaxies Like Grains of Sand involves an ending where we find out that the Milky Way is aging, and a new form of life that begins with humans and doesn't end with humans is emerging in another galaxy. Graybeard is a very poignant story about the future in which humans have become infertile and watching the last humans die out. There isn't exactly a happy ending to it. Barefoot in the Head involves drugs and war combined together. Frankenstein Unbound, we have a character who goes back and visits Mary Shelley and has sex with her, and they create a bride for Frankenstein. Along the way, he also wrote histories of science fiction, which are very well known, and did anthologies of science fiction along with Harry Harrison, the guy who wrote Make Room, Make Room. And he is a member of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. And in the 80s, which I'll come back to at a later point, he wrote the Heliconia series of novels, which is also a significant contribution into science fiction in the 1980s. But early on, he was definitely associated with New Wave science fiction and was very inventive and outrageous in lots of ways, as well as the other ones. But as a final figure connected with British New Wave science fiction, and a very memorable figure, Norman Spinrad. Norman Spinrad, for New Worlds, began publishing in installments a series called Bug Jack Barron. And it was about a TV host in the future who is very outspoken, engages in an incredible amount of sex with various characters in the story, and has a talk show in which people call in and complain about things that they're bugged over. And a member of the House of Parliament in England referred to the first installment of this story as filth, and that the House of Parliament. Parliament was actually contributing money through one of its grants toward New World magazine and was ready to pull the plug on the grant. But Moorcock stood up for Spinrad and for this book, which is so offensive and so filled with politically incorrect language. It couldn't be published in the 21st century, but it was published in the late 1960s. And it is an example of new wave writers attempting to really push the limits of what is good taste, of what is considered not too offensive to the human mind. And Bug-Jack Barron really pushes it. This was nominated for a Hugo for Best Novel of the Year in science fiction. In No Direction Home, the story collected in that book up on the screen, he imagines a future world in which everybody takes drugs and kids take drugs, and drugs are part of one's education and they're part of the evolution of consciousness. And we have one character in the story who decides to stop taking drugs. And it's hilarious as hell, the whole thing. Because in the end, the character who has stopped taking drugs decides that the reality of not having chemicals in his body is too torturous and ugly, and decides to start taking drugs again. It's a drug-saturated reality where the argument is presented, seriously presented under the humor, that maybe taking drugs isn't a bad thing at all, and maybe this is the way we're going to continue to evolve ourselves through the use of chemistry. Spinrad also got into a lot of trouble when he published The Iron Dream. And notice on the cover we have a swastika and a character that looks like Adolf Hitler on a motorcycle. And it's an alternate reality novel in which Hitler attempted to gain control of Germany, but failed at it, and immigrated to the United States and became a science fiction writer and wrote a story that he became very well known for in science fiction. And The Iron Dream is a story about Hitler, the science fiction writer, writing a famous science fiction story. And the science fiction story that he wrote was titled The Lord of the Swastika. So Spinrad really attempted to push the limits of what is considered acceptable in good writing, decent writing, et cetera, that isn't offensive to our taboos, our standards, and really pushed it and wrote some very unsettling stuff back in the late 1960s, 70s. There he is as a young man, there he is a little bit older. By the way, I didn't bring a clock with me. What time do we have, by the way?
We have 1:04.
Not 1:04 your time. Okay.
Yeah, 1:04 Eastern.
Okay, 1:04 Eastern. Okay. Let me do one more person and then we'll stop, okay, for a little break. Because we should move across the ocean to Harlan Ellison, Dangerous Visions in the Garden of Eden. Harlan Ellison was the most visible spokesman for new wave writing in the United States. As I mentioned, he edited and published the 3-volume series Dangerous Visions, in which Farmer's story that I mentioned earlier is included. And Dangerous Visions was an effort to try to publish stories that were that pushed the boundaries of imagination, of our values, that were dangerous, offended us in one way or the other, were strange and bizarre. And Ellison had been writing both science fiction and non-science fiction for decades by then. And Ellison was very well known as being an extremely outspoken, aggressive, and confrontational character who I happened to watch in person a couple times. And he definitely was that. He became very publicly visible. And actually, years later, after Dangerous Visions, he had an episode on The Simpsons, if you want to go look it up, where he plays himself. And but he first got into award winning with Repent Harlequin Said the TikTok Man, which is a story about rejecting the regimentation of a modern society, and is a very powerful, visceral story. A year later, and this is just about the same time he published Dangerous Visions, he won a Hugo for his story, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which is about a bunch of characters who are trapped underground by a powerful computer which has eliminated all of the human species and tortures the last 5 people that there are. And at the end of the story, the computer transforms the person's body so that even though he really wants to scream, he no longer has a mouth. A Boy and His Dog also won awards, another visceral, powerful story in which takes place in the future. A movie was made out of this one too. And we have a boy and his dog in a future dystopian reality, the boy being tempted by a girl who wants to take him below the surface so that they can procreate. And the boy has to decide whether he's going to go with the girl or whether he's going to stay with his dog. And at the end, in a very, you should have seen it coming ending, he feeds the girl to his dog. The story by him that I thought was his best story of his material was The Death Bird, in which he retells the story of the Garden of Eden, in which the devil turns out to be the good guy, and God, who controls the Garden of Eden, turns out to be a madman. He won a Hugo for The City on the Edge of Forever in Star Trek, which you may have seen that. And about 10 years ago, they did a very good movie on him. Harlan Ellison, Dreams with Sharp Teeth. And if you haven't seen it, it's a really great movie to watch. And one thing that's very revealing about Harlan Ellison that shows up in the movie is that he was very, very good friends with Robin Williams. They both had that kind of manicky, crazy, incredibly scintillating personality. So he became the spokesman for New Wave writing in America and supported a lot of New Wave writers over here. Now, there's a good place to stop for 5 minutes, okay? So we can, I can stop